Okay, are you ready for layers inside Photoshop? This is a huge aspect of Photoshop, being able to create layers and manage layers inside your images. And I'll explain exactly what layers are and how layers function in just a few seconds. But this is really a big part of Photoshop overall, and during our discussion on layers here, I'm definitely going to show you a few of the enhancements towards layers that we now have inside Photoshop CS5. But before all of that happens, I think we should probably get some sample files open here. And what I'll do is I'll just double click once again on my gray background into my project files, and I'm going to grab a file here called clouds, and I'll select him there, of course, and then I'm just going to scroll down, and I'm also looking for a file called statue. So what I'm going to do here is hold down the command key on the Mac here, or the control key on the Windows side, and select statue. So both files are now selected, and then I'll click on open. We'll grab both of those guys. So statue and clouds. And of course, what should happen here inside Photoshop is we should get both files open here in these document tabs there. I'm going to make sure that I'm on the statue file there. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Shift Tab on my keyboard to close out of the panels on the right-hand side, and then give this a try. I'm going to hit F7 on my keyboard, and that'll bring back my Layers panel. So F7 is a keyboard shortcut to bring back the Layers panel. Now, inside the Layers panel, I can see a thumbnail graphic of my overall statue photo here, and I see background. Now, what I want to explain here is when we bring in a digital photo, something we took with our digital camera, or perhaps we download something from the web, we download a graphic from the web, or we scan something into our computer and we bring it into Photoshop, it's going to be a flattened image. And what I mean by that is it's going to simply have a background layer. And a background layer essentially is a completely flat image. Now, what I can begin doing, and we'll do this in just a short while, is we can start combining images together and actually create almost a stack of individual images. And that's really what our layers are all about. So what we'll wind up doing is we'll take our clouds and we'll put the clouds behind our statue. And this is all really going to happen inside the Layers panel. Now, before we get to all that good stuff, maybe a quick tour of the Layers palette is in order here. So I have my background layer, as I mentioned, and you notice the little padlock there as well, suggesting that the background layer is locked. So I cannot edit a background layer. In just a short while, I'll show you how to convert a background layer into a regular Photoshop layer. And above that, I have some lock items there. They're all grayed out at this point. And I have a drop-down menu, which is grayed out. We'll talk about that. I have some fields here, opacity and fill, again, all grayed out because my background layer is not editable, right? And then all the way down towards the bottom of the Layers palette, we have some additional icons, and we'll definitely be making use of these guys here. Now, again, some of them are grayed out on me here, but these icons let me do such things as apply effects, apply masks, get into some color correction via something called an adjustment layer. I can create new layers if I want, just by hitting this new layer icon, this little page icon there, if you can see that guy. And I can create new layer groups via the folder there. And I can also delete layers using the trash can. So here's what we'll do. I'm going to go and create a new layer just by clicking on the page icon there. And now what happens is above my background layer, I now get layer 1. Now, there's nothing on layer 1. It's an empty layer. But here's what I'd like you to do. Beside each layer inside the Layers palette, over on the left-hand side, you can see we have this column here where we have some eyeballs. Now, try clicking on the eyeball beside the background layer. And what that will do is temporarily turn off the background layer. So we just disabled the background layer visibility. It's still there. It's just hidden, right? I can turn it back on just by clicking back inside that area there. That's really all there is to it. Make sure your background layer is turned off. And now I have layer 1. He's selected there, obviously. But as I can see over inside the main image window, all I see is this gray and white checkerboard pattern. What's up with that? Well, in Photoshop, the gray and white checkerboard pattern is Photoshop's way of indicating transparency. So in other words, there's nothing there. It's not white. It's nothing. It's absolutely clear. Again, when I created this new layer, I said that it was an empty new layer, right? So there's nothing on it. You and I could go and create some text on it, or we could pull in other images onto this layer, this sort of thing. We'll get to all that stuff. But notice now, with layer 1 selected, I now have all of the options up at the top of the layers panel available. So let's quickly run through some of these options here. We have lots of different lock options. For example, I can lock my transparency. I can lock my transparent pixels if I want. I can lock my image pixels, in other words, the opposite to my transparent pixels. I can lock the position of my layer. I can lock the position of the objects that sit on this layer. Or my personal favorite, I can simply lock everything. So lock the position, lock the transparent pixels, essentially make the layer uneditable, which is great. As I'm working along, sometimes I'll go and lock my layers once I get them to a suitable point. Now, just above all of these lock options, we have this drop-down menu here. And inside the drop-down menu, there are tons of options here. And this might seem kind of murky and a little bit too much, but essentially these are called blending modes. And we'll get to blending modes in just a little while. The short and sweet, though, for now, think of these guys as special effects or color effects, if you will. We can manipulate and apply effects between our different layers. And you'll see how this plays out in just a little while. And then finally, over towards the right, we have opacity and we have fill. So I can quite literally fade back the contents of a layer, almost make it semi-transparent, if you will. Now, I can't really give you an example of this because we don't have anything on this layer. But I hope this makes sense here, and we'll see more of these options as we go along. So finally, here's what I'll have you do. Turn on your background layer, turn his visibility back on, make sure that layer 1 is still highlighted there. He's selected there in blue. And then all the way down towards the bottom of the layers palette, bottom right corner, click on the trash can icon. This will delete layer 1. And we get a warning here. Are we sure we want to delete layer 1? I'm going to say yes. All right. So there's sort of a quick tour of the layers palette. All right, now what I would love to do next is combine our two images, our clouds and our statue as well. So here's what I'm going to do. I really don't like this whole tabbed document interface. It's just a personal thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head up to the application bar all the way up at the top of the interface to this arrange documents drop down. And what I'm going to do is simply choose float all in Windows. And now I get something like this, which is a little bit easier to work with. All right, now essentially what I want to do, and I hope this makes sense, is I want to take the clouds and I simply want to drag them into or move them into the statue photo or the statue image, right? What I'll get you to do before we actually get going with this is make sure that you're on your move tool inside your toolbox. And then as far as actually getting the clouds over into the statue image, I'm just going to kind of give us sort of a side-by-side here. We actually have a couple of different options, a couple of different methods for pulling this off, and I'll show you those methods here. First of all, and probably the easiest method, is to make sure that the image that you want to move, in other words, the clouds, is the active window. In other words, you're clicked inside this window. It's the active window inside Photoshop. And all I'm going to do is click inside the clouds and drag over onto the statue, something like this. Now, notice the black border that shows up around my statue image, indicating that I'm about to drop my clouds into my statue. I'll let go of my mouse, and that's all there is to it. Now, here's the cool part. I'm just going to move my statue back over here for a second, pull my clouds out of the way. Make sure you're inside your statue image now, and have a look over inside your layers palette. We still have that background layer, but now we have a new layer, which is called layer 1, and I can see inside that thumbnail, we have clouds. A couple of things here. First of all, moving an image over into another image is a simple matter of clicking and dragging, right? The second thing is, as I move an image over into another file or another image window inside Photoshop, what happens is Photoshop automatically creates a new layer for me inside that image's layers panel. I hope that makes sense. So in other words, if I go back to the original clouds here in the background, have a look at the layers panel there, it's just a flattened image. It's just a background image, right? All right. I hope that makes sense. Now, I mentioned that there were a couple of different ways to move images between one another, right? And this was the easiest method, or the simplest method, simply clicking and dragging with the move tool. Let me show you another method. What I'm going to do is I'm going to head back to my statue.jpg, and all I'm going to do is undo one step. So I could use my history panel, I suppose, or I should be able to head up to the edit menu and simply choose undo drag layer. All right, that brings me all the way back to where I started. Now here's another method for combining images or moving photos into other images. I'm going to go back to my clouds file, clouds.jpg, and this time, instead of dragging from the image window, what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to the layers palette, and there's my clouds background layer, and all I'm going to do is grab that layer and drag and drop them over into the statue image, something like this. All right, now what you and I get is pretty much exactly what we got previously. It's just a different method. Of course, over inside the layers palette now, I see again layer 1 and that background statue layer. Okay, perfect. Now, next up, what I'll do here is I'll close out of clouds.jpg. We don't need him anymore. And I'm going to head back to my regular old statue here. Here we are. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to show you inside the layers palette in terms of rearranging your layers and converting that background layer into a regular layer, and we'll see how to do that next. So this is where I find myself. I have a layer 1 inside the layers palette. That's our clouds, of course. And then below that, we have our background layer, which contains the statue. Now, what I want to do is I want to be able to rearrange my layers. Obviously, I don't want the clouds on top of the statue. I want the clouds behind the statue. We're going to do kind of a bit of compositing here, if you will. So check this out. This is how to convert a background layer into a regular, normal Photoshop layer. You'll recall from earlier on, I said that a background layer was uneditable as indicated by this little lock icon that we see there. So I can't do anything to my statue layer at this point. Instead, what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to convert this guy to a regular Photoshop layer. And I'm going to do so simply by double-clicking on the background layer. That's all there is to it, just double-clicking. And when I double-click, I get this new layer dialog box coming up. Now, you know, in the real world, when I double-click on my background layer, I simply click on OK, and that's all there is to it. And now I have, instead of a background layer, I now have layer 0. So what I can do now, and this is sort of the moment that I've been trying to get you to, is rearrange my layers. For example, I can take layer 0, he's selected here inside my layers palette, and I can click and drag him up inside the layers palette and drop him above the clouds layer. Now, this is an important thing to remember. Layers that appear at the top of the layers palette appear at the front of my image. Layers that appear towards the bottom of my layers palette appear at the back of the image. Does that make sense? So in other words, my clouds now are behind the statue. And you know, in the real world, a lot of my files have tons of layers. We can have lots and lots of layers inside our Photoshop files. Obviously here we only have 2, but that's really the idea here is I can grab my layers, I can drag them above or below the other layers that we have inside the layers palette. And, you know, I'm keeping it really simple here for you at first because I want to make sure that you really get the fundamentals of layers, but that's really all there is to it. So to recap, you can convert a normal background layer into a regular old Photoshop layer just by double-clicking on it and then clicking on OK inside the dialog box that shows up. Now, that said, it isn't very helpful to have layer 1 and layer 0 inside my layers palette, especially if I have 10 or 15 other layers inside my Photoshop file. So what I always try and do is I try to name my layers as I go, and you can always rename your layers. So here's what I'll do. Where we have layer 1 there inside the layers palette, what I'll do is I'll simply double click on that text, and that opens up the text, and now I can give this guy a proper name. I think I'll call this guy Clouds. Okay, there we go. And same thing with layer 0. I'll double click on that guy and simply call him Statue. Perfect. All right. So there you go. There's rearranging your layers and also renaming your layers. Now, before we continue, just make sure that your layer palette is set up exactly the way mine is. Statue on top, the clouds on the bottom. All right, now, obviously, I want to continue working on my image here. I want to finish my composite that I'm working on here with you. And I want to show you a tool that I haven't shown you up until now. I've kind of been holding out on you here. And this kind of falls into the group of selection tools, although we didn't see this guy when we were talking about the selection tools. I wanted to show you this tool on this image because this is a great example of where you can make use of this tool. He's called the Quick Selection tool, by the way. So here's what I'm going to do. I want to go into more of a full screen-ish mode. So I'm going to head back up to the Arrange menu there on the application bar, and I'll choose the first item here, the Consolidate All. So now I'm back to this kind of a mode. And you might want to zoom in just a little bit on your image, something like this. And the quick selection tool that I'm referring to, what he'll do, he's actually extremely cool, is he'll create selections almost as if you are painting. So you can almost paint a selection, if that makes sense. So here's what I have in mind anyway. The photo of the statue that I took here was obviously taken on a very drab day. This is cloud cover or sky, and it's obviously very overcast. And the idea here is that I want to get rid of this background. I want to keep the statue, but I want to get rid of the background, and I want to be able to see the clouds showing through underneath. And maybe we'll manipulate our clouds a little bit and make some adjustments and things. But that's really what I'm after here. So here's what I'm going to do. Hidden underneath the magic wand tool, way over inside the toolbox, we have this fella here, our quick selection tool. So make sure you grab this guy. All right, now you'll notice right away that my cursor changes to a circle. Now this circle is, you can think of this as your brush size. That's the size of the area, the size of the painting area that I'll actually be creating here. Again, don't forget we're painting a selection here. Now, what I can do is from the options bar up at the top, I can choose my brush size. So I just drop down this menu here, and I can increase my brush size if I want by dragging the size slider to the right, or I can make him smaller by dragging him to the left, or you can type a value in there. Hardness and spacing and angle and roundness, I wouldn't really bother with those guys. You can mess with them a little bit, but not really what we're after. Really, it's more the size that we're after. So maybe I'll bring this guy up to, well, let's say around 75 pixels. I think should be just fine. Enter to lock in that change. And now you see my cursor's larger, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm simply going to click and drag on the left-hand side of my image, and you can see I'm literally painting marching ants. How awesome is that? And what's cool here is as I'm painting, the tool is smart enough to grab adjacent pixels that are also the same color. So you could almost think of this guy as kind of like the magic wand tool in that it's selecting based on color, but it's selecting adjacent pixels as well. It's grabbing everything. We're painting this selection in. In fact, I went, I think, just below his elbow there, and I grabbed the entire left-hand side. It's awesome stuff. So if you want to give that another run, by the way, just deselect, remember Command D or Control D, and give it another try. So again, here on the left-hand side, I'll click and drag, and I'll just start dragging down the left side of the image, and pretty quickly I'll have that entire left side selected, which is awesome. I'll continue across the top of the statue here, grabbing that area there. All right, now, next up, we've got the left side and we've got the top, but there's that spot underneath the wing there and this little gap of space between the staff and the statue's arm there. Let's zoom in here, Command plus or Control plus, zoom in nice and close. Now, I want to show you some tricks here. I want to get this space in here, right? So what I want to do is I want to reduce the size of my brush, but it's kind of a pain in the neck to have to go all the way back up to the options bar and then mess with my slider, right? So here's what I'm going to do instead, and here's some shortcuts that you'll want to try and remember. Whenever you're working on a tool inside Photoshop that is a brush tool, or it falls into the group of brush tools, for example, there's a clone stamp tool, and we have our quick selection tool here, and of course there's the brush tool itself, and there's a few others. What I can do is I can change the size of my brush just by using my open and close square bracket keys on my keyboard. So in other words, open square bracket, if I tap that, that's going to reduce the size of my brush. You can see there my cursor is shrinking down. Or the close square bracket key will increase my brush size. Two keystrokes there that you'll want to remember. So I'm going to shrink this guy way down, something like this, and then I'll click and drag a little bit in there. Actually, I got it on the first try there. There it is right there. You can get a little picky. You might want to zoom in even closer and try and get some of these smaller areas here. You can do that if you want. I think I'm going to leave mine pretty much as it is, though. I don't want to spend too much time on this. You, of course, can spend as much time as you like. All right, we have the piece underneath the wing, or between the wing and the shoulder. Just increase my brush size here a little bit. Drag in that area. Perfect. There's a tiny little gap of space below the right hand, right in there. You got to be careful and make sure you get all these tiny little spaces here. And there's one more space, if I recall, way down in the bottom right corner. Perfect. Okay, I'm just going to zoom out, see what we have here. That's looking pretty darn good, I think. All right, now, the next thing that I'm going to do, really simple here, is I'm simply going to hit the delete key on my keyboard to get rid of any pixels that fall inside my selection, of course, the marching ants, right? Now, what happens, and this is fantastic, is the clouds, of course, are behind my statue, so they now show through because there's nothing inside the selected area now. There's no pixels at all, so anything now below the statue is going to show through like the clouds, right? All right, I'm going to go ahead and deselect, Command D or Control D. Let's make some final adjustments here to our initial composite here anyway. I'm going to flip back to my Move tool. Just the V key on my keyboard flips me back to the Move tool, of course. Now, here's what I want to show you. I'm just going to zoom out here a bit. Inside the Layers palette, I have the statue layer selected. So now what I can do is with my Move tool, I can actually drag the statue around inside my image, right? Now you'll notice that the top part of the statue and the bottom part of the statue are getting cut off, as well as the right-hand side of the statue as well. And that's because there is no image there. That fell out of the frame when I took the photograph. But nevertheless, I can move this guy around a little bit if I want. Or what I could do is I could switch over to the clouds layer now inside the Layers palette, and then drag on the clouds to reposition the clouds. And I can decide, all right, do I want my image to look more like this, or maybe something more like this? You know, really whatever you want, right? And you can actually do some really cool things. Now, that said, let me show you a cool trick here. And of course, I'm still on my Move tool, but up on the options bar, we have an auto select option here. I'm going to turn on auto select. And what that does is that saves me the trouble of having to select the layer inside the Layers palette. And you know, that's something I'm always forgetting. I'm thinking about the statue and I want to go and manipulate the statue. But one of the other layers inside the image is actually selected, so I have to remind myself to grab the layer, then go and do what I want to do, right? But with this auto select option turned on, now the Move tool is going to automatically select the layer for me. So check this out. Right now I have the statue layer selected inside the Layers palette, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag on the clouds, and what happens is, yeah, I can move the clouds, and the clouds layer automatically highlights as well. Or I could grab the statue just by clicking on top of the statue and dragging. And of course I'm moving the statue, and Photoshop automatically flips me over to the statue layer. Does that make sense? If I don't have auto select turned on, let me turn this guy off. And let's see here. Right now I have the statue layer selected inside the Layers palette. If I bring my cursor over top of the clouds and I start to drag, I actually move the statue, even though I'm dragging on the clouds, because I have the statue layer selected inside the Layers palette. Just a neat little option up on the options bar, this auto select. And you know, I find myself turning this guy on and off depending on exactly what it is I'm doing, but just a neat little trick that I wanted to mention. Okay, to finish things up here a little bit, I'm going to grab my clouds layer inside the Layers palette. Let's use our free transform to resize our clouds. So, do you remember your keyboard shortcut for your free transform? Command T or Control T. Now, I hit Command T here on the Mac, but I don't see my free transform at all. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here, and eventually, if you continue zooming out, you'll see your free transform frame. Now, the free transform frame is bounding my clouds, right? So this is the size of my clouds layer, if that makes sense. So in other words, I can drag my clouds all around something like this, right? Or I can resize them by holding down Shift and dragging on one of these corners, right? Let me just hit Escape and I'll do this one more time here. There we are. Size them down, something like this. Maybe zoom in just a little bit. It's really up to you. This is kind of the fun part here, is you can set this up in whatever way you want. If you want to move your clouds around a little bit, set it up how you want. And then, of course, when you're happy, just hit Enter to lock in that change. So there you go. There's some neat tricks for you, using your free transform and using that auto select to help you along with your layers inside your compositions. Okay, now, what I've decided to do here with this composition, I want to get some text into this image. Maybe this is going to wind up being a poster for an event, or maybe a postcard of some sort, or who the heck knows. And what I have in mind here is I want to create a white stripe running right across, let's say about the bottom third of the image, right? Now, I suppose what I could do is I could head over to the layers palette and I could select the statue layer, and I could create the white stripe directly on the statue layer. But you know, if I do that, then I would never be able to separate the white stripe from the statue ever again. Do you know what I mean? So in other words, if I create the white stripe directly on the statue layer, then it's a permanent change, or it's a permanent addition, I guess I could say, to my composition. And how I like to work is I try to keep everything as editable as possible. Who knows, down the road I might decide, you know, that white stripe really should have been across the top of the layout, or you know, something like this. So I hope that makes sense. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and create a new blank layer inside my image. And of course, we already know how to do this. I'm going to head all the way down to the bottom of the layers palette and click on the little page icon there, new layer. And I want to make sure that this new layer is all the way at the top of the layers palette, because I want my white stripe to sit on top of the entire composition, right? So he's going to be again at the front of the image, right? And then how do I actually go about creating a white stripe? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and grab my rectangular marquee tool out of the toolbox. By the way, there's lots of different ways to create white stripes and white rectangles. This is kind of the quick way. So I grab my rectangular selection tool, and all I'm going to do is click and drag out a rectangle, maybe something like that. Now, the cool thing here is it doesn't even have to be perfect. Don't worry about it. If you kind of mess it up, or maybe it's too short, or it's, you know, not stretching all the way across your image, don't worry about it, because I'm going to show you a really cool trick for adjusting your rectangle in just a moment here. All right, now next up, what I'm going to do here is I want to fill the rectangle with white. So in other words, that's going to create our white stripe for us. Now, just do me a favor and hit the D key on your keyboard. And what that will do is that will ensure that your foreground and background colors down at the bottom of the toolbox are at their defaults. In other words, you should have black in the top left and white in the bottom right. All right, now, with that set up, what we want to do now is we want to fill the selection with the background color. How do you do that? Well, give this a try. On the Windows side, hold down Control. On the Mac side, I'm going to hold down Command and simply hit your Delete key on your keyboard, and that will fill your selection with the background color. Awesome. As a quick point of interest, if you're interested here, so holding down Control or Command and hitting Delete will fill with whatever color you have inside that background color swatch. Holding down Alt on the Windows side or Option here on the Mac and hitting Delete will fill with your foreground color, whatever color you have in there. All right. Good stuff. Go ahead and get rid of your marching ants. You can deselect there, Command D or Control D. And I mentioned a moment ago that I wanted to show you a method for adjusting your white stripes. Maybe you're not happy with it. Maybe you want them to be thicker or thinner, or who the heck knows. Again, because we created this guy on his own layer, he's now independent of the other objects inside our composition. So he's independent of the statue, he's independent of the clouds. So I could, for example, grab my Move tool. I just tapped the V key on my keyboard. And what I can do now is I can move my rectangle around inside my image. And again, he's floating on top of everything, so I haven't made any, destructive changes to my image or anything like this. Everything is still editable, but give this a try. What if we use our free transform on this white stripe? So I'm going to hit Command and T on my keyboard here. And maybe I'll just zoom in a little bit so we can see this here. There he is. And I'll just make this guy a little bit skinnier maybe, or maybe I'll bring him down a little bit on the bottom there. Or perhaps in on one side, or perhaps in on the other side. This is great. I love this because it's completely editable, and that's how I like to work in Photoshop. Again, whether it's special effects I'm doing or color correction, I'll show you all this stuff later on, how to work with this stuff in a non-destructive way inside Photoshop, because I like to have options. I come back to this 6 months from now and go, white stripe across the bottom. What the heck was I thinking? The white stripe should be across the top, something like this, and it should be skinnier and, you know, all the rest of it, right? So again, we have options. We have choices here. So long as we keep everything on its own layer inside our document. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with something like this. I'm going to hit Enter to lock in that change, and I'll just zoom out here so we can see how this guy looks. I think that looks pretty good. You know, we should rename our layer, though, before I forget, and I'm bad for this. I get into that creative process, and I wind up with layer 13, layer 14, layer 15 inside my layout, and I go, what the heck is on layer 12? So I try to remind myself as I go to rename my layers. So again, just double-click on layer 1 there, and maybe I'll just call this guy Stripe. Okay, perfect. Enter to lock that in. Okay, now this next item that I want to show you, I'm really excited to show you this because I think this is arguably my most favorite new feature inside CS5, Photoshop CS5 that is. Do you know what Smart Objects are? I use Smart Objects all the time, particularly between Illustrator and Photoshop, and also sometimes between Photoshop and Dreamweaver. That's something that came around in CS4. Well, now what we have are Photoshop Smart Objects. Now, if you don't know what that is really, I think it'll make a heck of a lot more sense when I actually show you this. But kind of the short and sweet, I guess you could say, is imagine having a Photoshop file inside another Photoshop file. So here's what I'm going to do here. We have our statue composite image that we're working on. We have our layers there, the stripe, the statue, the clouds, it's all good. I'm going to flip over to my Finder window, at least here on the Mac, and I'm looking at my project files folder. Now, if you're on the Windows side, make sure to open up a new Explorer window, a new folder window, and navigate towards your project files folder. And inside your project files folder, you'll find a file. I've got them selected here, text.psd. So .psd, he's a Photoshop document, or he's a native Photoshop file. Essentially what I want to do is I want to add this file into our statue composite. So you're going to need to arrange your screen sort of like I have my screen arranged. I have Photoshop in the background, I can see my statue, but then on top of that I have my project files folder open and I have the text.psd file selected. Getting this to actually work is a little bit weird, but kind of follow me on the magical mystery tour. Essentially what I want to do is I want to add text.psd to the layout that you and I are working on inside Photoshop. So again, it's going to be a Photoshop file inside another Photoshop file. That's the whole idea here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take text.psd, fasten your seatbelts here. What I'm going to do is drag this guy into my statue image window down inside Photoshop. Drag and drop him in there, and you get this. Now, what we see here, I hope this worked for you, is the contents of text.psd. Okay, let me zoom in just a little bit here on my file. Now, we get a little bit of text in here. Place your text here, May 17th, 2010, and so on. We get a large gray rectangle, and then the entire structure of this object is enclosed, if you will, inside this frame. And this frame looks almost like the free transform frame, doesn't it? And by the way, it functions in exactly the same way as well. I could scale this object or rotate it around or whatever. I think in my case here, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to reposition them down towards the bottom of my layout. Something like this I think is fine. And then I'll just hit Enter to lock that in. All right, we're looking good here. Now, have a look over at your layers palette. And what you should find is at the top of your layers palette, you should have a new layer called text. So in other words, it created a new layer based off of the file name that you and I just dragged in, right? Text.psd. Make sure this guy's at the top of your layers palette, by the way, as well. Now, this is the cool part. This is the part that I want to show you. This little icon here in the bottom right corner of the layer thumbnail indicates that we have a smart object. Now, what the heck is this thing called a smart object? Well, again, it's a file inside another file, right? In our case, it's a .psd file inside another Photoshop file. Now, what I want to do, though, is I want to edit this smart object. So check this out. I'm going to double click on this little smart object icon over inside the layers palette, and I'm presented with this really cryptic dialog box. It reads here, after editing the contents, choose file save to commit your changes. Those changes will be reflected upon returning to statue.jpg or whatever file you're currently working on. The file must be saved to the same location. If the Save As dialog box appears, choose Cancel and flatten the image before saving. Now that's really kind of weird and cryptic. It doesn't really tell us exactly what's going to happen here, so let's reluctantly click on OK and see what happens here. All right, now, this is the cool part. I'm brought into text.psd. So in other words, it just opened up text.psd. Well, actually not exactly, not precisely. It's actually opened up a temporary file based off of text.psd. But as you can see over inside the layers palette, I now have 3 text layers and a gray background layer. So I have a layer for St. Peter's Hall, I have a layer for the date there, May 17th, 2010, and I have a layer called Place Your Text. So all of these text layers here, and you can tell that they're text layers because the T icon there, all correspond with what we see down inside the image window. So what I want to do here with you, and I hope this is making sense, and if it's not, hang in there and it'll make sense as we go along here. What I want to do is I just want to set up a couple of simple changes here. I want to change the text here from Place Your Text to the actual name of the event. Again, maybe this is going to wind up being a poster for some kind of an event or a charity meeting or something like this. So I'm going to hit the T key on my keyboard, and what that does is that flips me over to the text tool inside my toolbox, and what I'll do is I'll click and drag over top of this text here to change it. And by the way, as a quick aside, you may not be seeing the same font that I have here. You might not have the same font installed on your computer. But in any regard, I'm going to type in the name of my event, which is Medieval Dinner. There we go, something like that. I'll go back to my Move tool inside the toolbox. And by the way, here's a neat little trick. I'm on my Move tool, and you can see that the right edge of Medieval Dinner isn't lining up with the St. Peter's Hall or the date there. So with my Move tool activated, if I just tap my left arrow key on my keyboard, I can actually nudge this object around, which is kind of cool. So in other words, what you can do is you can select a layer inside your layers palette there, and then use your arrow keys on your keyboard to nudge that object around, so long as you're on the Move tool. Okay, cool. I think we're looking good here. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the background layer as well, that nasty gray background. Let's save our file. Command S or Control S on the Windows side. Let's close the file. Command W or Control W again on the Windows side. Back to our statue layout, and there's our changes inside Photoshop. So now we can move the smart object around wherever we want. Again, we can nudge it if we want using our arrow keys. And it's all about this smart object here inside our layers palette. So all the stuff that we see here, the text here, and if we had that background layer and so on, that's all compiled, if you will, inside this smart object inside our layers palette. So again, it's kind of like having a file inside a file. It's extremely cool, and I can think of about a billion applications of where I could use this in my own work. That's why I think it's one of my favorite new features inside Photoshop CS5. So I hope you like it. Well, you know, I hope you're enjoying and I hope you're having fun here creating this sort of this composite image that you and I are building together. You know, I gotta show you something else though, something called layer styles. And I think you're really gonna enjoy this because this tends to delve into more of the special effects side of Photoshop, which is, of course, a lot of fun. So what exactly is a layer style? Well, you could think of it as a special effect or some kind of an effect that would be applied to an individual layer. And of course, I think once I actually show you this, it'll make a heck of a lot more sense. But imagine things like drop shadows or overlays in terms of colors or gradients or, you know, special effects, this type of thing. So what I'm going to do here, what I'm going to attempt anyway, is I want to set it up in such a way so that the statue here has a white outline all the way around the outside, and we'll see how this matches up. So hopefully it'll kind of match up with the white stripe that I have here. So maybe I should zoom in just a little bit here so we can see what we have. All right, now to get started here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to head down to the statue layer inside the layers palette. And what I'll do is I'll double click on this layer, but instead of double clicking over top of the text as if we were going to rename the statue layer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click more towards the right hand side of the layer, over towards this side. And when I do so, I wind up inside the layer style dialog box. Now, inside the layer style dialog box, by the way, it's a huge dialog box, a lot of options in here, but running down the left-hand side of the dialog box, we see all of our effects. So, for example, drop shadow, as I mentioned, inner shadow, outer glow, inner glow, bevel and emboss, which is a personal favorite, satin color overlay, and on and on and on, right? So here's the cool thing. Let's say, for example, I want to try bevel and emboss. Well, all I do is I put a check mark beside bevel and emboss, and I move my dialog box out of the way, and now I see this weird, wacky effect taking shape inside my image. Now, what's really cool is it goes even further than that. If I actually click on bevel and emboss on the left-hand side of the dialog box, I'm now presented with a huge array of options. So it's kind of a two-step process. You turn on the effect and then click on the effect, and that'll bring you into the settings for that effect. And, you know, there really isn't any sort of science to this. It's really more just messing around in terms of, it's really more of an artistic process, I suppose you could say. So I have a depth slider here so I could make this emboss effect even deeper, crank up the size, you know, something like this. Boy, you can really do some crazy things here. And by the way, I'm giving you really just sort of the very, very basics here in terms of just getting yourself started with layer styles. All through the different settings here, shading and so on. What's even crazier is I could apply more than one effect to my layer. And of course, this is only affecting the selected layer, the statue layer, right? So maybe, for example, I come along and I say, all right, well, let's throw a drop shadow on this as well. So I'll turn on drop shadow. And then, of course, now I have my drop shadow settings because I actually clicked on the text there, drop shadow. And that put a check mark beside it, and it gave me the settings. So, of course, I have my sliders here, opacity and angle and distance and spread and size and all the rest of it. And it's really just a matter of coming in, messing around with the settings, messing around with the options, and having fun, right? All right, so let's say I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, this looks awesome. I'm happy with it. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK to commit those changes. Now, all along I've been saying that I like to work in a non-destructive way inside Photoshop. So I've gone and I've piled on some special effects onto my statue layer, but what I love so much about layer styles is they're non-destructive and they're fully editable. So have a look at your layers palette. There's our statue layer. Notice the icon here, the FX, the effects icon there, indicating that we have a layer style applied to this layer. And I can see my layer styles. There's a drop shadow and there's bevel and emboss. Now here's the cool part. I sit here and I go, you know, maybe going with the drop shadow was a bit much. Let's see how it looks without the drop shadow effect. So I'm going to click on the eye icon right beside the drop shadow item, turn it off. Or turn off bevel and emboss, turn the drop shadow back on. Or I go, you know what, let's turn these guys back on, but maybe I want to adjust my bevel and emboss. So I'll double click on bevel and emboss, and that brings me back into the layer style dialog box, back into the bevel and emboss settings here, and I can continue messing around with my settings here until I get this looking exactly the way I want, right? Which is awesome. It's fantastic. All right, now next up what I'll do is I'll show you how to remove a layer style and then perhaps apply a new one. So at this point, what I'll do is I'll click on OK to commit my new changes. And next up, as I say, I'll show you how to remove a layer style and then apply a new one. And of course, what I'm thinking is that outline, that white outline that I had mentioned previously. Okay, so let's get rid of this layer style, this bevel and emboss that we applied to our statue and also the drop shadow. You know, there's a couple of different ways to get rid of a layer style, or layer effects as they're also sometimes called. But you know, usually what I do is I just bring my cursor over top of the layer that has the layer style applied to it. I right click on the fella, and then, well, we've got a couple of options here. We can copy the layer style, which by the way is really cool. I could copy the effects that I've applied to this layer And mine's grayed out right now, but then what I could do is I could go and right click on another layer and then paste the layer style. So in other words, I could copy the effects on one layer and paste them over onto another layer. Very cool. But what I'm after here is clearing the layer style. So go ahead and choose clear layer style. That gets rid of all the effects that you've applied to your layer. You can see the layers palette there. It's cleared them all out. Let's go after that white outline that I promised you quite a while ago now. So once again, I'll double click on the right side of the statue layer, back into the layer style dialog box. I'm going to head down to an effect called stroke, otherwise known as outline. And what I'll do here is I want to change the color of the stroke. Notice I now have this black outline all the way around my statue, which looks kind of cool, but I'm after white. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this little color thumbnail, and what that does is brings us into a dialog box that we haven't seen yet. This is Photoshop's color picker window. And you know, in a minute I'll give you a tour of this dialog box. It's very cool, but all I'm after is white at this point. So what I'm going to do is inside this sort of this color area here on the left hand side, I'm going to click up in the top left corner to select white, and you'll notice I get white right off the bat there. Perfect. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And you know, at this point, you might want to move your dialog box out of the way so you can see your overall layout. Maybe I'll zoom out just a little bit here. That's another cool trick. I can zoom in and zoom out while I'm still inside this dialog box, which is kind of cool. I think that looks great. I think it looks really cool. But you know, inside the layer style dialog box, I have a few other options. I could increase the thickness of my line by dragging on this size slider if I want. So maybe I want something a little bit thicker. And then we also have position on the outside, on the inside, something like that. And maybe I should zoom in here so you can see the difference here. So there's inside, there's outside, or I could say the center. So ride the center between the sort of the inside of the statue and the outside. I think I like the outside there. Something like that I think looks pretty darn cool. All right, that looks great. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. I'm quite happy with that. And you know, let's go and apply a few other effects to one of our other layers. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and change the color of the text here, the medieval dinner. And you know, I could go into the smart object. Don't forget, this guy's a smart object. I could double click on that smart object icon and go and change it in the original file and so on. Or I could just apply a special effect to the text layer itself. Let's do that. So I'm going to double click on the right hand side of the text layer, back into the layer style dialog box. And I'm not going to do anything too crazy here. All I want to do is change the color of the text. So I'm going to choose color overlay, and right away all my text changes to red because that's our default color here. But once again, I'll click on this color swatch and I'm back into Photoshop's color picker. Okay, I promised you a tour of the interface here. Now, usually when people come into the color picker, they're instantly drawn to this area here on the left-hand side of the dialog box. But really, it's the center, this sort of center color ramp that you want to start with inside the dialog box. So notice we have a little grab arrow there, a little slider. Grab that guy and drag up or down to find the sort of the range of colors that you want. For example, maybe I want to go into the greens for whatever reason, right? As soon as I let go, you'll see the text changes to green there. And then inside this left-hand window pane, I can then choose the shade of green that I want. Maybe I could go into some of the darker greens if I like, or maybe into the lighter greens. So obviously we have darks at the bottom, lights towards the top. We have some grayish effect there over towards the left-hand side of this window here. One idea that I had was making the text the same color as the statue, trying to get it close to the same color as the statue. So I could go into these grays here, maybe somewhere in here, something like that, which to me looks kind of cool. Or, you know, we could probably even go a little darker there, maybe something like that. Or the other thought that I had was we could try and make the text the same color as the sky, again, just to sort of match it up a little bit. So then in that case, I'd grab my color ramp slider here in the middle of the color picker dialog box, go into the blues, and then try and get a blue that's sort of a similar color as my sky. It's a little bit more gray than that, isn't it? Maybe somewhere in there. I'm just kind of taking wild guesses here. But you get the idea, I'm sure. That's really what it's all about here. So I come in here, I set it up. I think that looks pretty good. Click on OK. And then from this point, I could throw on some additional styles if I want. Again, maybe a stroke, maybe black, something like this. Increase the thickness, whatever you want, right? You can really go crazy here. And who the heck knows, maybe a drop shadow as well. You could come in here, set up a drop shadow. Again, the idea here is just to sort of fiddle around and experiment and see what you can come up with. And if you're sitting there not really liking what you have, you can uncheck these check boxes to kind of back yourself out of what you've done here. Click on OK. Again, that's all there is to it. And again, what I love about all this is it's all non-destructive. So if I really wanted to, I could strip all these effects off, go all the way back to where you and I started. And that's really the cool thing about layer styles, the layer effects here in Photoshop. I've got to show you something here inside Photoshop's Layers palette called Blending Modes. But before I do, I just want to mention that I made a couple of quick, very minor changes to my layout here. First of all, I collapsed down all of my layer styles here inside the Layers panel just by clicking on this arrow here over on the right-hand side, just to kind of keep things nice and tidy. And you know, the other thing that I did, and I'm not sure if you can see this on screen or not, but I changed the color of the stroke that was on my text. Instead of going with a pure black, I changed it to a very, very, very dark gray. So it's almost like a dark charcoal gray, just to kind of give it a little something. In any regard, let me show you this thing called blending modes inside Photoshop. And I'm going to give you kind of the abbreviated version of blending modes because we have so much more to get to. What I'll do is I'll select my stripe layer. And once again, before I actually get going here, I'll kind of give you a sense of what blending modes are. Think of them as special effects. Again, layer-based special effects. So I select my layer inside the Layers palette and I go, all right, I want to apply some effects to this layer. Now, specifically, what a blending mode is, and I don't want to get too crazy on you here, but it's a mathematical algorithm. It's a mathematical calculation where it'll essentially take the pixels on the selected layer and blend them in some way with the layers beneath, if that makes sense. Now, that's kind of the sort of the textbook description. The actual real-world description or the real-world example is grab a layer, and then at the top of the Layers palette, drop down this blending mode menu and go crazy. But the only reason why I give you the textbook explanation is because you might be sitting there going, okay, what really is the difference between lighten, if I choose lighten, and difference? What is the difference between those two? Well, again, it's a calculation between the pixels on the stripe layer and the layers beneath. And you can see I got a result here down inside my document. So that's difference being applied to the stripe layer, which is really cool. That's kind of a cool effect. But what I could do here essentially is hunt around inside my list of blending modes and see if I can come up with something. For example, maybe I'll wind up on, let's try lighten, for instance. And it didn't really do anything to the white stripe. But now what I can do is I can add in the dimension of opacity. So what I can do is I can actually drop down this opacity slider and fade back my white stripe, something like this. So in other words, the further towards the left I drag this slider, the lighter the white stripe or the object on the selected layer becomes. You can do some really cool effects here. And again, I'm giving you the really quick sort of down and dirty version here. So you can really go crazy and do some cool things. And you know, it gets even crazier when you select a layer that actually has lots of different color on it. Now, I could use my clouds layer, but there's nothing beneath my clouds layer. So I'm gonna have to go with statue, and he only really has gray in him. But I could grab the statue layer and then let's go and try, for example, multiply. And I get something like this. And then I could take that multiply and I could fade him back a little bit into the clouds, something like this, right? To get that sort of a result. Or maybe I want to make the statue look almost like a ghost, sort of a ghost effect. Well, usually for that I would go with overlay and then drop the opacity down, something like this, right? Again, some very cool results. And by the way, as you're messing around with this opacity slider, instead of actually dropping down the slider and moving the slider, you can actually click and drag right on the opacity text inside the Layers palette to sort of scrub back and forth, if you will. So in any regard, that's kind of the short and sweet version of blending modes. I wish we had more time. Again, they're non-destructive. If I want to go all the way back to where we started, all I need to do is switch my statue layer from overlay or from difference or whatever effect I'm on right now, all the way back to normal, which is found at the top of the list, and I'm all the way back to where we began. pretty soon what you'll find inside your Photoshop files as you begin adding layer effects and adding more elements and throwing in text and maybe the odd smart object is you wind up with a ton of layers. And some of the compositions that I have inside Photoshop wind up being so huge that I actually get a scroll bar here and I have to scroll up and down inside my layers palette. It's crazy. What you can do is you can actually start to organize your layers into groups. In other words, literally what you get is a folder, a file folder inside the layers palette that you can then move layers into and help keep things nice and organized. And I use these all the time because, again, my compositions, my layouts get pretty crazy in terms of the number of layers. So how does all this work? Well, what I'm going to do is way down at the bottom of the layers palette, we have a folder icon which will allow us to create a layer group. So go ahead and click on that guy and we get group 1, a little folder there. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on group 1 and that'll allow me to rename this guy. And maybe I'll rename this guy as text and then I'll hit enter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my stripe layer and my text layer and move them into the text layer group or the text folder. Now, you know, I could grab one and drag them in and grab the second and drag them in one at a time. But what I can also do is I can select multiple layers inside Photoshop simply by selecting one, holding down Control or Command and clicking on the other one. Now I have 2 layers selected and then drag and drop them into that layer group just like that. So now these 2 guys are a part of my text folder or my text group. So in other words, that's the layer that has the medieval dinner text and also the layer that has the white stripe. And then I can collapse these guys down. That's all there is to it. It's really, really simple. But you know, as simple as it is, let me show you an even faster way to work. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to expand my text layer group. I'll select both of my layers that are inside there, so the text and the stripe, and I just held down Command there and selected the second guy, or of course Control on the Windows side. I'll grab these 2 guys and drag them above the text layer group to actually pull them out of the group. Just like that. So now there's nothing inside the text layer group. And I'm going to get rid of this group here just by dragging them down to the trash can icon down at the bottom. So now I don't have any layer groups. And then check this out. This is a trick that I love. I do this all the time. Select the text layer, hold down Control or Command, grab the stripe layer, and you know any other layers that you want to be a part of the same layer group, select them all up there, and then try this. Command G on the Mac or Control G on the Windows side. Boom, you got a group. Expand them open and you'll find your layers. How do you like that? Pretty awesome. Of course, double click on that guy to rename them if you like. And that is all there is to it. So you should see some of my actual real world files. It's mostly folders now inside the layers panel, and I expand them open and each folder has, 5 or 10 layers inside it. Just me trying to keep all of my work organized with layer groups. There's a few final techniques that I'd love to show you in terms of working with your layers and managing your layers and so on inside Photoshop. Let's get started with something that's referred to as linking layers. So here's the example that I'm going to show you. I'm going to twist open my text layer group there. And of course, I have the text layer and the stripe layer in there. Now let's say, for example, that down the road at some point, I decide that I want to move this block, the white stripe and the text. Well, if I drag on the stripe, of course, the medieval dinner text stays where it is, right? So in other words, these 2 layers inside the layers palette are not connected, right? Check this out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of these guys, hold down Command or Control and select the other guy. And essentially what I want to do is I want to link these guys together. So, in other words, whatever happens to one layer is also going to happen to the other layer. So to do so, I'm going to head up to the Layers Palette menu up at the top. Pop that guy open, and there's an option in there called Link Layers. Go ahead and choose that fella there. And you'll notice that as soon as you choose that command, we now have these little chain links that show up over on the right-hand side of the layer. So now, when I select the stripe layer and I move him around inside the image, the text is going to go with him. Or if I grab the text layer and drag the text around, the white stripe is going to go with it. So who the heck knows? Maybe it'll wind up being across the top or maybe across the extreme bottom or, who the heck knows? But just a neat little option that I thought I would at least mention to you there. So pretty cool. All right, what else can we do here inside Photoshop? Well, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my two layers here, the text and the stripe, and let's say I don't want them linked anymore. I'll go back to the layer palette menu over on the top right corner, and I'll choose unlink. And instead what I could do is I could head back to that menu with the two layers still selected, and I could choose merge layers. Now what that means is that would mean that the smart object, the medieval dinner text layer, and the white stripe would now all be compiled or flattened down onto a single layer, if that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and choose the command to show you here. So now I only have one layer, whereas before I had two, which by the way now means that I can never separate the text from the white stripe. Well, not without a lot of hard work anyway. So something to keep in mind, although I don't often merge layers myself. I'm just going to undo that, Command Z or Control Z, and go back to where I was. There's another option here that I should mention as well, just while I think of it. And he's available from the Layers palette menu as well. I'm going to pop this guy open. And we have a command here called Flatten Image. And if I choose Flatten Image, what happens is the entire Layers palette is all crushed down, all the way down into one single background layer. Which means my layer effects are gone, my smart objects are gone, my editability is completely gone, everything's gone, right? Which I don't like so much, obviously. So, of course, I'm going to undo that as well. I very, very rarely use that command. It's nice to know that it's there, but again, I rarely use it. Okay, a few other quick things that I want to show you here. This next command that I'm going to show you is kind of a sort of a house cleaning command, and it's new inside Photoshop CS5, by the way, as well. Let's say as we're working along, we wind up with a ton of extra layers. You know, these empty layers that sort of wind up cropping up every once in a while. So I just clicked on the new layer icon there down at the bottom of the layers palette. I have a new layer there inside the text layer group, and you know, maybe I'll go and add in one or two more extra empty layers. Now, how do you wind up with empty layers? Well, you know, as you're working along, you're selecting stuff, you're deleting stuff, you're moving objects between files, and sometimes you wind up with empty layers. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a command that looked for empty layers inside your file and automatically got rid of them? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to show you here. And again, it's new inside Photoshop CS5. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to head all the way up to the File menu, down to Scripts, down towards the bottom, and there's our new command, Delete All Empty Layers. Click on that guy, and Photoshop does its job and cleans out all of those empty layers. Very cool stuff. All right, wonderful. Final thing that I want to show you here, saving this file. Way back when, I had you open up two files, statue.jpg and clouds.jpg. So we started with JPEGs, right? JPEGs don't support layers, if you'll recall. So if I choose Command S or Control S on the Windows side to save this guy, Photoshop wants to save this guy as a .psd file, a Photoshop document. In other words, Photoshop wants you to try and maintain the editability of this file. If I just save this guy out as a JPEG, well, again, I'm going to get all of my layers flattened down to that background layer. Instead, I want to keep this guy in an editable state, not an edible state, but an editable state, so that I can come back to him, you know, 6 months from now or 2 weeks from now and continue working on him, right? So make sure you're saving your files as .psd documents. I'm going to save this guy up on my desktop, so I'll just navigate towards my desktop, on my Mac here at least. I'm going to call him statue_completed, and then I'll go ahead and save this guy up. All right, I'm going to get a compatibility warning here. I'll just go ahead and click on OK to take that. There you go. There's tons of info on working with layers inside Photoshop. I hope you had fun. And as you can see, again, it's one of these major issues, major topics inside Photoshop. You saw selections, that's a big deal. Resizing, that's a big deal. Layers, obviously, is a big deal. And what we have next is also a big deal. So let's keep on going here.